Cool. Alrighty, shall we get started? How's everyone doing? It's a smaller crowd today. Everyone is out too late partying. They're all sleeping. No? Okay. So, good morning. Welcome back to TechEd New Zealand. My name is Nathan Totten. I'm a technical evangelist. I work at Microsoft. I work on Windows Azure, Node.js, Windows Azure websites, some stuff like that. So today we're going to be talking about Node.js. So hopefully that's what everyone is here to talk about. Let me get my clicker. So just a little quick agenda. We're going to do a brief intro to Node with some slides. We're going to talk about Node.js on Windows and Windows Azure just quickly, and then we're going to jump into demos. So a pretty simple agenda here. A little bit of context and assumptions. So this is a 200 level talk, so it's going to be there's going to be some coding, but it's not going to be like super deep into some of the really technical stuff of Windows Azure and Node.js. I am assuming that you already know, or at least you already know kind of what Node is. You've maybe played around with it. It's not necessarily a requirement that you're a Node developer. We're going to talk a little bit about Node.js, but I'm not going to cover, like the basics of JavaScript programming or things like that. So there's an assumption there. The same with Windows Azure. I'm not going to cover, there's been a number of talks about Windows Azure. I gave a talk yesterday about Windows Azure websites, which is what I'll be doing most of the demos with. So I'm not going to be covering what Windows Azure is, again, assuming that you kind of already know some of that stuff. And if not, it's not a big deal. But yeah, I'm not going to be repeating information you've hopefully already heard. So just really quick review of what Node.js is. Actually, quick question before we dive in. Who has used Windows Azure before? Okay. Who's used or played around with Node? Okay. So I think we're at the right level here. So just for those that haven't used or aren't maybe too familiar with Node.js, if you're here maybe just to kind of learn a little bit about what it is. Node.js, JavaScript on the server, right? You can, if you're a JavaScript developer, you can program your app in JavaScript. So a lot of people don't like JavaScript. I assume everyone in here does. Otherwise, I don't know why you're here. So Node.js, event-driven I/O, server-side development. It's a pretty easy programming language framework to use. It's not thread-based, unlike more traditional framework language like C#, .NET. So it's just a single thread, single event loop. Makes programming actually quite easy on it. You don't have to worry about things like multi-threading, locks, anything like that. Node.js is extremely efficient and highly scalable. So common uses of Node.js are real-time communications using something like socket.io, which I'll demo in a little bit. Basically things like long polling, very large number of HTTP requests, stuff like that is extremely efficient on Node.js just because of the way it works, the way it allocates memory, which I'll talk a little bit about. So this idea of the single-threaded event loop, we've got a nice little animation here to describe that. So basically what this means, though, is again, Node is running on a single process, single thread. So every action that occurs in a Node.js application, basically a node process is only doing one thing at a time for the most part. So, for example, if a new web request comes in from the internet, a Node application will basically handle that. Work is queued up, so things like, again, handling a web request, querying a database, timeouts, receiving the results from a database query, things like that. Those are basically all happening one at a time. So those just get queued up and keep happening. So from a developer standpoint, this does a couple different things. One, it makes it super easy to develop Node apps. Again, you don't have to be a master with, you don't even really need to understand anything about multi-threading, locks, anything like that. The other thing to note is all this work, especially things like web requests, are actually this queue of work makes things super efficient from memory allocation standpoint. So in a web application, say a .NET application, basically a web request comes in and a thread and a certain amount of memory is allocated for that request. In a Node.js application, basically a request, a queue event, things like that are just a small heap allocation on your server. So you're actually going to get a very large number of requests or operations with a very small memory footprint in Node. So this makes Node applications extremely efficient. I mentioned a little bit, Node is really good for things like sockets, polling, these real-time communications. So Node is commonly used for, say, game development, or like the one of the common demo apps for Node is a chat room application. But for game, real-time mobile development, things like that, Node works super well as a backend. It also works really well as for things like services, proxies, things of that nature. JSON web services are extremely easy to build in Node.js, both from an efficiency standpoint and also because you're using JavaScript, so you're natively using JSON. Basically, there's not, you don't have to serialize and change the data types like you would in in most other languages. It's also good for these client-oriented web UIs. There's a number of web frameworks that exist in Node that make building these client-side web UIs super easy. Node is okay for things like these simple forms web applications. If you're building an application that basically is just collecting some data, doing some simple forms, Node's okay. I mean, it works, but you might find the experience, the developer experience, the tools available may not be as developed as they are on some other applications. So you're probably going to find an easier time if developing something like a simple CRUD application on a more mature platform like Ruby or ASP.NET. And then it's definitely wrong for doing these CPU-intensive type activities. So you wouldn't want to do video rendering or media encoding, image coding, things like that on Node.js. CPU-intensive operations, because of the way, again, it's just a single thread, single process. Your application will basically be waiting on these processes, so it's only going to be able to do one thing at a time. So for things like video encoding, you're normally going to use multiple threads for something like that. Queue out the work, or basically branch out the work on multiple processors. Node is not designed for that, so it's not a good use for those type of activities. Couple pros and cons quickly for those who are kind of trying to figure out what Node.js is if you want to use it. JavaScript, right? So this is good or bad depending on your opinion of JavaScript. A lot of people like it, a lot of people don't. The good thing is, though, from a real world purpose, a lot of people know JavaScript. So you can, if you're building a Node application, perhaps your client-side developer building client-side web apps can do some of the work on the back end because it's in a language that's familiar. It's clean, very consistent API. It's pretty easy to learn. It doesn't have the Node.js core API is not enormous like something like .NET or Java. There's only a very few core set of libraries, so it's pretty easy to learn and get started. Again, simple concurrency. You don't have to be a master of threading, things like that. Idle connections, I kind of mentioned this with the way memory is allocated. Idle connections in a web server are nearly free. So unlike, again, an ASP.NET server running on IIS where everyone who's connected is sort of using a reasonable amount of resources, you could have thousands of connections on a Node.js server, and it's really only going to use a very small amount of memory for those thousands of connections. If those connections aren't doing anything, they're nearly free from a resource allocation perspective. Also very modular. There's a lot of choices with Node.js. You can build a lot of different types of applications. There's a very rich open source community building these modules, so there's a lot of different things to choose from. Cons of Node.js, though, on the flip side, it is new. There aren't a lot of standards with Node.js, right? So there's a lot of different choices. There are a lot of different modules. So if you're the kind of developer who wants to, do something the right way, Node.js may not be for you in terms of getting started, just because there's a lot of different choice, a lot of different modules. You can build a web application 50 different ways on Node.js. Again, not widely adopted. That's changing, and it's pretty bare metal. So there aren't many tools like. There's certainly nothing on the level of like Visual Studio for Node.js, right? It's mostly just text editor, command line. So if you like, the drag and drop, simple stuff like that, I'm assuming most of you in here probably don't since you're at this session, but just for context, you basically use a command line and text editor for Node.js. So Really quick, a couple of the application frameworks that are available. There's a lot of choice. For web applications, the one we're going to be talking about today, and the one that's most popular, most common, is this one, Express. There are a variety of other ones. There's Connect, it's a standard middleware actually using Express, and then there's a bunch of other web application frameworks that are available. Again, a lot of choice with Node.js. Express, though, is the one we're going to focus on today, and I'm going to demo, and also the most popular one. Express, you can think of sort of like ASP.NET MVC if you're not familiar with that. It's basically it's a framework for doing routing, template engines, things like that. So Node.js initially was developed entirely for Linux. It was a native Linux platform, did not run really on Windows. About, I would say, almost a year ago, Microsoft started getting involved in Node.js, and we actually helped them port Node.js over to Windows. So now, running Node.js on Windows is native. It's not running in something like Cygwin or an emulator. You're running Node.exe. The performance of Node on Windows is actually comparable, sometimes better, sometimes worse, depending on the particular operation. But basically, you can use Node.js on pretty much any platform now with the same performance. Running Node on Windows, we actually have an IIS module. So you could run Node just as a raw process if you wanted to, Node.exe with your server. You can also host it in IIS. We actually use, on Windows Azure websites, we use this module IIS Node and host Node inside of IIS. And basically gives you some advantages of IIS with Node. Most modules are supported as is. There are a few times where you're going to run into something that was built natively for Linux, but that's not really an issue anymore. So you can pretty much move a Node.js application from a Mac to Windows to Linux, whatever, without any changes. Node offers a really nice package manager. For those that have used NuGet on the Microsoft stack, Node basically has the same concept. Where you can use this package manager called npm to actually do installs. So it makes it very easy to build your application in a modular way, which I'll demo. IIS Node, I mentioned, basically a couple of the advantages of running a Node.js application on IIS is you get some of the advantages of, you basically get the best of both worlds. For IIS, this module handles things like process management. So Node only runs native, Node.exe runs on a single processor, doesn't scale out. So IIS Node actually handles running your Node application on multiple processors. So if you're running on an 8-core box, IIS Node will kind of spawn that out and manage that for you. So you get that kind of automatically, multi-core. You get auto updates, so if you actually change your application, redeploy a file, IIS Node monitors your files and will reboot your application for you. You get things like the things that you would be familiar with in IIS, like logging. You get all the access. Basically, Node pumps all its error logs and things like that into IIS logs, so you can use familiar tools for that. You can also run it side by side with other content types. So we've actually put out some samples that you can download. You can find them on Windows Azure website or on our GitHub repositories. But you can actually run, say, an ASP.NET MVC application side by side with Node, which is actually an interesting scenario. So, for example, you could use the real-time capabilities of Node.js running something like socket.io, which I'll show, side by side with say ASP.NET MVC to build, say, your front end, which kind of, if you like one or the other, makes it really nice. You can, again, run them side by side on the same server. Windows Azure websites, you can deploy a Node.js and ASP.NET app, PHP even, all side by side because it's running IIS Node. You can run it the same way, minimal changes to the application, and as I said, you get that integrated management experience. So Node.js running in IIS Node again. It uses a web.config. Basically, it's just a handler. So this is really the only thing that's needed in your web.config file to actually run your Node application. With Windows Azure websites, we'll actually do this for you by default, so you don't even need to be aware of or understand how IIS Node works or how the handler is set up. And again, this makes it easy to run other. You can just add, if you wanted to add Node to, say, an existing ASP.NET app, you could just add this handler and you're good to go. You can also use things like app config settings, so you can store your connection string, all that information, and Node will actually pick that up. IIS Node will pass that as environmental variables. So it makes it super easy. That's it. No, I'm just kidding. This is the last slide, and then we're going to switch to demos. I don't want to forget this, so please submit an evaluation, and That'll be it for slides. So now I'm going to move on to demos. Oh yeah, and you can win things, right? Everyone likes winning stuff. So that is all for slides. Let's move over to the computer. Does anyone have any questions before we move on? Comments? Anyone like to leave? He's leaving. No, I'm just kidding. Yes. Sorry, what was that? Can you share session state between, say, ASP.NET and Node? No, I don't believe so. I've actually never tried that before. I don't believe so, though. Normally, so in Windows Azure, you would actually externalize session normally anyway. In something like or in something like Windows Azure caching services or just SQL. So you're normally going to externalize that anyway. I don't believe you can share session, but that's an interesting question. I can look into that though, and it may be something that's on the roadmap. I'm actually not sure. That's a good question though. Anyone else before we move on? Cool. Okay, so I have some demos. Basically, we're going to start off pretty simple. Actually, was anyone in my Windows Azure website session yesterday? Just a few. Okay, cool. So this is there's about 5 minutes of repeat. Sorry for the 3 people that were in there, but I didn't want to. I assumed most people would be new. So basically, I want to just show you how to get started using Node.js, how easy it is getting started with a Node.js application running on Windows Azure. So can everyone see that? Is that okay? Font size? Yes. Okay. Cool. So we have this full for Windows Azure. You may have seen the portal. I'm going to use mostly the command line tools. So we have this portal for Windows Azure. You can do all this stuff through the UI. But since we're Node developers, we're going to do everything through the command line. So we have with Windows Azure, we actually have a full set of command line tools where we can manage our Node.js application, create websites, things like that. So creating a Node website is actually super easy. So let's go through and actually just create that. So Azure site create my Node NZ. And we're going to enable Git. So one of the really cool things about Windows Azure websites is we actually support Git publishing. So what I'm actually doing here, Azure site create my node NZ / Git, is I'm creating a site. I'm going to actually call Windows Azure Services, create a Windows Azure website called my node NZ using my default location account, things like that. And then I'm going to enable Git publishing on that. So for Node.js, what this means is we don't have to use something like Visual Studio. We don't have to use something horrible like FTP. We can actually use Git to publish through the command line. Sorry, is everyone familiar with what Git is? Okay, cool. So Git is, if you're not, Git is just a source control system. So basically you can store your project in, say, GitHub and actually just commit your source to GitHub, and when you're ready to publish, you can use that same command line, same Git command line to actually publish to Windows Azure. So it makes it super easy. So now I'm going to go ahead and create this site. It's going to run through some stuff. Again, it's calling Windows Azure services. It's looking for my site, etc. Finding my default location, which is East US, and then provide my username, which is, for this one, is ntotndemo1, which I messed up yesterday, so hopefully I won't do again. So, okay, so we're basically, again, we're creating that Windows Azure website, and then they're creating a Git repository on the server, which we'll use actually to publish that site. So now we have, and it's also initialized my folder as a Git repository. So we actually have a couple things in here. It's added a Git folder, which is just used for source control, and then a Git ignore. So to create a Node, the simplest thing to do to create a Node website is to use Express. Again, Express is that framework I talked about. It's basically it's a web framework for doing routing, templating, things like that. So using our Node package manager, npm install Express. We're just going to download from npm. We're downloading that Express template engine, and we're going to use that to create a default site. So Express actually, so now we have this Node modules folder with Express in it, and Express actually ships with a script where we can actually use that to set up the basic structure of our website. So we're going to run that script, express bin express. And so this is going to just, again, create our default structure. And then we actually have to run npm install one more time. So what we have now is the basic, Express website. Windows Azure expects the sort of program the sort of entry point to the program file to be named server.js. Express by default uses app.js, so we're just going to rename app.js to server.js. Oops. And then let's just go ahead and run that site locally. So node server.js. So I'm running locally, listening on port 3000, and let's just navigate to that, localhost 3000. So there I have my basic Express website. So we're ready to publish to Windows Azure. Let's just go ahead and do that. So since we're using Git, we need to commit that, git add. We're going to just add the files, and then git commit new Express site. And then git push Azure master. So this is actually going to, so GitHub, the command line actually added a remote, which is basically added the remote, which is the Git publishing for Windows Azure websites, and we're going to push that. We're going to now push that to Windows Azure websites. Let's just go ahead, and while that's happening, it's going to take a. Oops, password is. Either that one or the other one. There we go. Okay, got the password right this time. Everyone applaud. Just kidding. Okay, so. One person did, thank you. So let me refresh. Oh, there we go. Hello. So this is the website I just created. So we'll actually see here in the deployments we actually have. It actually that's all. It's really fast. So it already happened. But basically what we do is when we push the source to Windows Azure websites actually does a npm install. So all those modules, that Express module, anything else we're using, we don't actually need to send up to Windows Azure, which means we're actually only pushing our apps files, which make it very fast and efficient. And then on Windows Azure, we actually pull in those modules you need. So it makes it again super quick, which is partially why it didn't take very long. So let's just go ahead and browse to that now. My Node.js, and that's it. So that's our site published to Windows Azure. And oh, we've got 40 minutes left. So no, I'm just so it is super easy to get started, right? But let's do something a little bit more interesting. So a couple things I want to point out just about Node development on Windows. Let's go ahead and open that site we created. So we ran that locally. Hello, Node. So we ran that locally. We did a git deploy to Windows Azure. Only took a few seconds. A couple things I just want to show you one thing I want to show you in particular about developing on Windows. So when we ran this locally, if you remember, we just ran node server.js. So we're running node.exe here. Node is actually in my path variable on Windows. So that's why I don't need to type the whole thing. And then I'm just passing again the program entry point node server. So and then it's running that server on port 3000 here. So one thing, though, is we want to, when we're editing our application, let's go ahead and edit our view, or edit our, actually, so let's go ahead and change our default route to default. So this is basically our routes here we have set up. Let me just go ahead and refresh that. So you'll notice the app didn't actually refresh. So Node actually caches everything. So one trick for our Windows developers is there's a module called Node Supervisor, which I already have installed. So instead of running node.server locally, I'm going to run supervisor.server.js. And this actually does something similar to what so IIS Node gives this to us, gives this sort of benefit to us when we're deploying. But when we're developing, we don't want to have to restart our Node process every time. So supervisor actually looks for changes in our files. So I deleted that route, and let me go to default now. So that default route is created. And let me just go ahead and change that back. We don't really want that called default. And go back to to local, refresh. And we'll see that our default route is gone, and now we're back locally. So supervisor actually, again, looks for changes in files and restarts our node process. So this basically, again, when you're developing locally, this is a huge time saver. You don't want to have to manually stop and start your node process every time you make a change to your application. So this makes developing super easy. Another thing I want to point out really quick before we move on with the demos is everything I've showed you here is all built. The Node or the command line tools for Windows Azure that I've shown are actually built on Node.js. And what this means is we actually you can actually run those command line tools on Windows, Linux, or Mac. So the nice thing is everything I've showed you here and everything I'm going to show you, except for the very last thing, which I'll point out, will actually run across platform. So most of us, this is a Microsoft conference. I understand most of us are probably Windows developers. I'm obviously using Windows. But the nice thing is, we don't live in a world where everyone always is on Windows, where everyone is always on Mac, whatever. So the really cool thing about this, about Node development, about Windows Azure development, is it does work across platform. So, the place I used to work before Microsoft, we had a lot of developers that used Macs. And that always kind of ran into some problems because we were developing everything on ASP.NET MVC. Cool thing about Node is you could, using source control, I could push something up to Git or GitHub. Someone can pull it down on their Mac and they can run it. They can pull it down on their Linux. They can edit, or on their Linux box, edit something, push it back up. So completely cross-platform. Of course, I work at Microsoft, so we want you to be using Windows 8. That would be awesome. But if not, again, everything here I'm showing you does work across platform. So I've shown you the basic app. Now I want to move on to something a little bit more exciting. Let's go ahead and kill this. So I already built an application. I don't want to have you. I don't want to. It would be really boring for you guys to sit here and watch me build this up. So I have a little application I've already built called Do Drawings. So let me just go ahead and switch over to that. That's in my GitHub repo. And open command window here. So this Do Drawing, and let me close this. And okay, we're open. So this is actually this is still an Express application, but we've added a few more advanced things to this. So again, I mentioned one of the common things with Node.js is real-time communication, using long polling, using WebSockets, things like that. So this drawing application is actually a collaborative drawing app, and the easiest thing to do is to just show you supervisor.server.js. So let's just refresh that. We're on port 3000 again. So again, very similar, simple app. I've added some very fancy CSS here, as you can see. Isn't that beautiful? And what I have here is an HTML canvas. So I've actually set up socket.io. Socket.io is a Node module that runs, it can run separately or it can run on top of this Express app. And socket.io abstracts away some of the stuff for doing real-time communication in Node.js. For example, managing WebSockets, doing long polling, things like that. Socket.io basically works on almost any browser, IE 6, and actually I think it might work on IE 5.5, which is ridiculous. Like 2 people left using that, but they support it. But it works on basically IE 6 and above. It works on Chrome, obviously. It works on Firefox. It works on mobile browsers. And so Socket.io basically, again, abstracts away some of the differences between doing real-time communication. So WebSockets is basically the most ideal for doing real-time communication. Allows for very efficient sending and receiving information between the web client and the server. But not every browser supports that. Only IE 10 supports it from IE. Chrome supported it for a while, of course. Firefox has supported it for the last few versions. But there's other ways to do it, like long polling, things like that. So Socket.io takes care of all that for you. Now, so what this application does is basically takes our canvas and watches the points that the line segments we draw in here, and using Socket.io, it actually will send that information to our other clients. So I can draw a fun little picture here. And let me just go ahead and we see all this is getting sent to the server. I've got some pretty ridiculous logging enabled. Just to prove this is working, let's open a different client, Chrome. And so now, with my other... There we go. Fancy. Okay, I have it actually after like 500 points, I have it clear it so that it doesn't get too crowded. So we have basically a real-time application here. Not the most exciting application unless someone gets in there and starts drawing dirty pictures. Then it could get pretty exciting. But we're running it locally. So I want to show you a little bit how this works. Again, it is somewhat much, so I'm not going to code it in real time. But I want to describe that, and then we're going to add some features to that. So basically, again, we're using Socket.io on the server. So this is a module. Oops, here we're installing that module. Sorry, here. So socket.io, basically a very simple API. You can actually find their documentation on socket.io.com, or socket.io, excuse me. So super simple API. You just see these two little snippets here. So socket.io is both a server-side technology that runs on Node.js and also a client-side technology that still JavaScript runs on the web browser. So what socket.io basically does is give us this API for responding for events. So in this case, on draw, let me show you the client side of that. I just have a regular HTML page, and then I have this drawing controller. So every time we draw a line segment on here on mouse move, we're actually send drawing. So every time we draw a line segment, what I'm actually doing is recording that in an array, and then I do have a timeout that basically sends that sends that to the server every second. So that's why there's a little bit of delay. But basically, we're recording every segment we draw in that JavaScript application, and then sending that to the server. So socket.emit, and then the action draw, and then the data. And so the server then, this is the client side JavaScript, and then this is the server JavaScript. So we were emitting this action draw and passing this data, and this is super easy. Socket.onDraw, it just listens for the draw event and then does something. In this case, we're actually rebroadcasting that to all the other connected clients. So socket.broadcast.emit show, and then sending the data. So that's actually really, there's some extra stuff in here, and some extra stuff to make the client side a little fancier, since obviously this looks amazing. But basically, you can see that it's really, really simple to get this basically this real-time application. So you could imagine how you could do something much more interesting with this, like building a game that does real-time notifications between clients, building a chat or messaging application. But this basically shows how easy it is to do with Node.js. So we can definitely publish this to Windows Azure. This will work on Windows Azure. There's one caveat though with that. So this application, socket.io, can use WebSockets, long polling, which is just making continual HTTP requests with long timeouts. One thing to note, though, about WebSockets on Windows, we actually only support WebSockets in Windows Server 2012 on IIS 8. So Windows Azure right now is only running on Windows Server 2008 with IIS 7. So we don't, unfortunately, support WebSockets quite yet in Windows Azure. So what I've actually done in this sample is I've made it so that it only uses long polling and it doesn't use WebSockets, which I'll deploy this to Windows Azure, and we'll see that it actually does still work quite well, and it's still very responsive. We are going to be adding Windows Server 2012 to Windows Azure websites and also the other services on Windows Azure. You can use a VM in Windows Azure right now, but we don't have our Windows Azure websites platform. We will be upgrading that to Windows Server 2012 soon, at which point you will be able to use WebSockets natively. Right now, you do have that limitation, but as you'll see when we deploy this, it does still work. So let's just go ahead and let's just go ahead and deploy this then. So I already have this set up, so we don't have to do that again. Let's just go ahead and do git push. Oh, actually, no, I don't have it set up, sorry. Azure, hang on, we're going to push this to do drawings. So actually, let me show you how to do it manually. So we have this app, do drawings. So I already have this set up with oops. So I already here we go. So I already have this set up with Git publishing. So let me just go ahead and add this remote. So I have this site that I already created, do drawings. So let's just go ahead and do, oops, is this? Yep. So let's go ahead and add this remote. Same thing we did before, git remote add Azure, and just go ahead and paste that URL in there. So now since we already had the Git repo set up, and let's just go ahead and push that out to Windows Azure. So git push Azure master. Takes just a few seconds, and then you'll see it's running Node Package Manager, installing those packages I'm using, which is Express, Socket.io, and a couple other ones. So that'll just take a second. So we've got that pushed up to Windows Azure. Let's open that up. And it's working. So let's open two browsers again. And there we go. Why is my color wrong? There we go. That was weird. So I just want to show you kind of how that's working in the background. So let's open up the Chrome Developer Tools and go to the network. So reload the page, reload this page. So this is actually what's occurring for long polling. So we see here there's actually this request that's pending. So I have this set to continually make HTTP requests while this is running, and they have a 30-second timeout. And so this is how when we actually do something, you'll see that request is made and the data is sent. And the same thing is happening on this side, which is what gives us that push to Windows Azure. Again, if we were using WebSockets, we would actually just have a single connection. It would be more efficient. It would be a little faster. We'd have a single connection, and we'd be able to push and send and receive data between the server and the client very easily. So again, we will be adding Windows Server 2012 with IS support, IS 8 support in Windows Azure websites, as well as the rest of Windows Azure shortly, which will solve that problem. So again, but very simple and pretty. Oops. Yeah. So cool. And anyone else can go on and do drawings. We're going to go at the end, and I'm going to see if anyone's drawn anything horrible. So anyway, so yeah, that's actually why I made it reset after 500 points, because I didn't trust you guys. So we'd come back and find something terrible in there, so it erases itself. No, I'm just kidding. So anyway, so that's a pretty simple socket application. So we're not using anything. The only thing we're doing now is hosting our site in Windows Azure, our Node.js application in Windows Azure. However, Windows Azure is more than just compute, right? Windows Azure is also about services. So we have things like SQL databases in Windows Azure. We have table storage, which is a schemaless storage. We have blob storage, which is just for basically storing binary file data. All kinds of services, caching, service bus for doing reliable messaging, things like that. So we also support most of those services in Node.js. We're continually adding support for them, and most of them you can use. Some of them don't. We don't have a library, but we do have actually a Node.js SDK for Windows Azure. So you can actually use from Node.js, you can use our table storage, our blob storage, service bus, and actually you can use SQL database, which is Microsoft SQL Server running in Windows Azure. We've actually built a library that allows you to query SQL Azure from your Node.js application. You can also host, we actually, through our partner ClearDB, we host, we actually offer MySQL in Windows Azure. There's a MySQL module that allows you to query MySQL through Node.js. Additionally, you could also deploy your own services. A popular data store for Node.js applications is MongoDB. MongoDB is a document database. So we don't actually have a service for MongoDB in Windows Azure, but because we support virtual machines, both Windows virtual machines and Linux virtual machines in Windows Azure, you could actually deploy, say, a Linux VM, put MongoDB on there, and access that, use that from your Node.js application running in Windows Azure websites, even running in a VM, running wherever. So Windows Azure, again, is more than compute. With Node.js, we also support we support a lot of the different services we offer in Windows Azure. And any of them that we don't support, we're definitely working on to add support to in the future. So what I want to do here is actually I want to do something pretty simple. I don't want to take too much time, but I want to show you how easy it is to actually use Windows Azure table storage. So we've got all these points. I'm going to keep building on this drawing application. What I'm going to do is actually store all the points for my drawing, all these line segments in Windows Azure table storage, and I'm going to show you just how easy that is. So the first thing we need to do in our drawing application is actually install our Azure package. So npm install install Azure. So this is our Azure SDK. We're going to just install this to our application. And this gives us all the functionality for accessing table storage. And we'll see we've got that Azure folder there now. Our package JSON, we have all those packages we need, which is how Windows Azure knows which packages to download. So I already have my server set up with, again, with socket.io, and I've got a few snippets here because, again, I don't want to make you wait for me to type all this out. So adding Windows Azure to this is super easy. We're going to do this require, which is sort of our import for our module, require Azure. So this imports our Azure SDK. And then I'm going to create a Windows Azure table. So I've already actually created my cloud storage account in Windows Azure using the portal, but I need to create a table if it doesn't exist. So this is our API. We're just going to get a table service here. I just hard-coded my credentials in here, but as I mentioned, since we do support the web.config file, normally you would store these settings actually as app settings in your web.config, or actually a YAML config we also support, which is a kind of a different markup language for config. So you would normally store these in the configuration setting, which you could change in Windows Azure using here. So you could actually access these settings in the portal here. But I'm just, for simplicity, I've hard-coded them. So this is the API for creating a table storage. You'll note here it's asynchronous. It has this callback. Again, everything is asynchronous in Node.js since we are running on that single thread. We never want to block our operation. Otherwise, our app's just going to do nothing until that operation returns. So we're asynchronously creating this table is the first thing we're going to do. And then let me just grab that second snippet. And then we're actually just going to insert all of these segments into that table. So let's go down. Oops. Let's go down to here. So this is our onDraw, our socket.io event that gets fired when those line segments are sent to the server. And I'm just going to insert all of those into our Windows Azure table. So I'm just going to loop through all of them. We have our data, this array of those line segments. I'm going to set a partition key and row key, which are two keys that are required for Windows Azure table storage. And then other than that, I'm just going to pass in that object. So table storage is, again, schemaless. So we don't need to tell Windows Azure, we don't need to tell it what data or what the shape of our data we're storing in table services. All I need to do is insert an entity, and it'll take care of all that for us. So again, I'm inserting asynchronously into this segments table. I'm inserting data, and just to prove that's real, I have this Cloud Storage Explorer. Here's my drawing storage account. Let me refresh that, and I don't have any tables in there. So let me just run this locally. Save that, and supervisor server.js. So that's listening on port 3000, and it started, and we should have a table now. So we have one table called segments with nothing in it. Let me just run our application again. Refresh that. And so now, let's draw some segments, a couple hundred of them, and execute our query. And there we go. So we've got a bunch of data inserted into SQL Azure. So, into Windows Azure table storage. So we obviously inserted a lot of stuff pretty quickly. Excuse me. So Windows Azure table storage is super, as you can, I mean, that was like 8 lines of code to do all that, to create the table and insert those entities. Similarly, we could query that. We could update data, things like that, all the things you would expect. So Windows Azure table storage is a super scalable, schemaless data storage mechanism. So it works really well for Windows for Node.js applications, particularly because handling the schemaless data is really easy. I mean, you're just using JSON data, so you can query that back from table storage and access those properties. It's not nothing complicated like with .NET. You would kind of have to serialize that into an object, things like that. With everything's dynamic in JavaScript, so it makes working with something like table storage extremely easy. Similarly, we could use SQL to do that. In the interest of time, I'm not going to show that, but we do support SQL databases, both actually on Windows Azure, or if you're developing like a local Node.js application, you could use local SQL for that as well. So pretty simple to use Windows Azure storage. Again, there's a lot of different services. We have a queuing service. We have Service Bus, which allows for queuing or basically remote delivery of messages. We offer, again, blob storage. Say you wanted to store a bunch of image files or your static content of your application. And all of those are available for Node.js developers to use. So let's just close that up now, and VMs. Okay. So the next thing I want to show you, actually, let's do some debugging. So everyone wants to know, how do we debug a Node application, right? So we're running this locally. We have, I have some logging in here, sending some console log, but this isn't really an amazing. This is not a good debugging experience at all, right? You want to be able to step through your application. You want to debug in a real sort of fashion. So Node.js actually also offers, this is not a Microsoft thing, but there's an open source module called Node Inspector. You can use Node Inspector to actually debug your Node application both locally or remotely if you wanted to. Generally, it's done locally. So let me actually open a new command window, and let me just start. So the Node Inspector is actually is its own utility that runs. So we just, let me spell that right, Inspector. So let's start that. So Node Inspector is running on port 8080 now. One thing to note about Node Inspector is it will only run in WebKit browsers. So for Windows, you pretty much have to install you basically have to install Chrome to use this. They are working on supporting other browsers, but right now it basically only works in WebKit. So localhost 8080. So I know that's terrible. I know everyone here is an IE user, right? Who here doesn't use IE? I'm just kidding. You have to leave now. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. So we have Node Inspector here. It's not doing anything because we haven't started our application. So let's go ahead and now start our app, node server.js, and we're going to pass the debug flag. So now we're running our application on port 3000 again with the debug flag enabled. So Node Inspector now can connect to our application, and actually we can use this. There we go. Connection refused. Well, that didn't happen an hour ago. What? Hang on. Maybe I run it as admin. Debugging. Oh, there we go. That was the problem. Or not. What? Okay. Well, that's not as fun. The demo gods are angry. Let's just go ahead and restart this. See what's going on. So, oh, wait. Maybe this is it. Do I need to do this first? Oh, that's the problem. My bad. You've got to pass the debug flag first. I don't know why. That's bizarre. Node Inspector. Let's start this again. All right. Pretend none of that ever happened. When you're filling out your review, that never... What? Oh, geez. Anyone have any ideas? Shout them out. Start debugging. Let's refresh. Why is this not connecting? Oh, is it connected now? There we go. Okay, it is connected now. Perfect. Okay. These are not the droids you're looking for. Okay, so we're connected, and nothing bad ever happened. So let's go ahead and just put some brakes. So this is our debugger. So this is running in the browser, but it offers everything you would expect from a rich debugging client. You can obviously stop it. You've got your call stack, all the good stuff. You've got a console where you can just execute things yourself. Where did my mouse go? My battery died. All right, a little bumpy. All right, moving on. So anyway, so let's go ahead and put a breakpoint here. Let's put this at right here when we send a drawing. So let me just go ahead and do that. And our breakpoint was hit. And you can see we have a nice debugging experience. Data, object, all the fun stuff you would expect. Socket, object. So a very nice, pretty rich debugging experience in Node.js. There's also another option for debugging Node.js applications that I find to be much more cumbersome and horrible. If you, for some reason, like Eclipse, there is also you can download so Node.js is built on the Chrome V8 JavaScript engine. So there's also an Eclipse, there's the Chromium debugging tools. You can also use Eclipse and the debugging tools to actually do this similar thing, debugging your apps using Eclipse. This is, in my opinion, much better. I mean, it basically offers all the same benefits without the disadvantage of having to put Eclipse on your computer. So personally, I don't like it. I'm sure some people do. So that's debugging. Again, this works on both Windows, Linux, Mac, whatever client you want. It does only work again in WebKit browser, so Chrome or Safari. That's all, I think. So pretty easy. A lot of, all the things you would expect from debugging on a Node.js application. So the next thing I want to show is actually something that only works on Windows. So you've seen a lot of different tools, the command line tools. I've been using Sublime Text as my text editor, but it's basically just it's a fancy text. It's a fancy version of Notepad. I don't have IntelliSense. I don't have some of the rich things like that. The debugging experiences, everything's kind of separate. So works pretty well. A lot of people like it. But for Windows, we actually do have something special. We actually we've built into our Web Matrix client, we've actually built in rich node support. So how many people have used Web Matrix before? Nobody? It's a toy, right? Nobody would use it. Yeah, I know that's what you're all thinking. That's what I think too, sometimes. But the one thing I will point out is it actually offers an amazing node development experience. So Web Matrix, for those that aren't familiar with, is our sort of is a Microsoft IDE kind of targeted toward web developers. It's much more lightweight than Visual Studio, but it offers some of the benefits that you would expect from an IDE. So it's sort of a middle ground between using just Notepad versus Visual Studio. However, for Node.js, it actually offers a really cool experience that I want to show you. So let's just go ahead and click a template. The first thing you'll notice is we actually have Node.js templates with Web Matrix. So, excuse me, this is Web Matrix 2. It's in release candidate. Should be shipping soon. So let's actually just create that same site we just made, an Express site, but using Web Matrix. Accept the thing, download the stuff, and do all its things. So we're just using we're using Web Matrix to do basically what we did in the command line. We're creating an Express site, and why is it doing that again? That's odd. Do not regard this. It's been doing this every time I create a new project. Okay. We will awkwardly wait, similar to what we had to do yesterday. This is a release candidate. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It'll just a second. It's installing. Visual C++. So what you'll see in Web Matrix is that we offer again the things you'd expect from a rich IDE. We offer syntax highlighting. We actually offer IntelliSense. We offer integration with Node packages. All kinds of very rich stuff. We also do. It doesn't have its own debugging experience, but through a module you can actually very easily attach to the Node Inspector debugger that I actually just showed you. So. Very exciting. Installing. Continuing on. Downloading. During this quick intermission, does anyone have any questions? Yes, so that's a good question. The question was, is there any intention of adding this support into Visual Studio? We don't have any plans at this time. It's something a lot of people have asked for. It is something we've been considering. It isn't planned as of yet. It does work actually quite well in Web Matrix, but there's definitely people that want to use Visual Studio. It's something we've looked into. It's definitely not something that's I guess, planned at this point. But I wouldn't rule it out. So any other questions? All right, I did this literally an hour ago, and it seems to think I need Visual C++ again. If we cancel it. Yes. So the question was, at the beginning, for the Express app, I renamed app.js to server.js. So the reason I did that is because that's the default configuration of Windows Azure websites. Windows Azure websites in the default web.config, which is the web.config we use if you don't provide one, we look for a server.js. There we go. Most frameworks in Node actually do use server.js as standard. For some reason, Express is the one that uses app.js. If you want to keep it as app.js, you just have to provide your own web config file and just change that variable to look for app.config instead of server.config. Okay, there we go. That took uncomfortably long. So we've got about 5 minutes, which is plenty of time. So this is our editor here. So let's open our server.js file. So what you'll see is rich IntelliSense, as you would expect. So app. And then we've got all the app.route. So we have, again, rich IntelliSense in here. The thing to note is this is JavaScript, but WebMatrix is smart enough to know that this is server-side JavaScript. So we don't have document, window, anything like that. This is pure Node JavaScript. However, it's also smart enough to know in our application that if we have a client-side JavaScript file, that we do have document.getElementById and stuff like that. So very, very rich, very nice IntelliSense. This makes it super easy to actually debug or to actually use to learn Node.js on Windows Azure. Quite cool. The other really cool thing about this, so I showed you kind of the default IntelliSense, right? But we also offer IntelliSense with Node modules. So if I actually were to install a module in here, which let me just quickly do. Websites, Express site. So if I put a module in here, let me just change the directory, npm install socket.io. So I'm installing socket.io in this application I've just created. And refresh this. There we go. So let's check to make sure that finished. Okay, so that finished. So the cool thing is our IntelliSense is also smart enough to detect packages. So require. So we do two things. We do IntelliSense on the packages, so you get all the default ones like you get all the default ones like DNS and what is there, file system. But you also get ones that are installed. Not ones. This isn't a list of every package. This is actually a list of just the packages that are installed. So I just installed socket.io, and I actually then get IntelliSense in socket.io. I'm supposed to. Okay, pretend that worked. What do I need? Oh, it's running. That's probably why. Hang on. New, okay. Socket. Well, it sometimes works. So it does work in Express. So you see here in Express. So a lot of rich IntelliSense. It is an RC, so I'm going to chalk that up to a bug and blame it on somebody else. So it should. Basically, there's very rich IntelliSense. Looks through the modules you have installed. So very cool. If you're learning Node.js, this, in my opinion, is a very nice way to get started. Again, you get the syntax highlighting. Node.js uses, which I didn't have too much time to cover, it uses a view engine called Jade. We also do offer this syntax highlighting in Jade. We also have various other Node-specific templating engines that we offer syntax highlighting for. So a very rich experience, and only available on Windows, but really nice way to get started. So that's actually about it. We're out of time. So again, please submit your reviews for this evaluation. It would be much appreciated. It helps me improve, helps us improve. And I will be available. We have only about 30 seconds left, but I'll be available after this if you guys have any other questions. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of TechEd.